It's the Oscar-winning documentary film you will likely never see. An Israeli-Palestinian film titled No Other Land faced suppression as no studio or streaming service in the U.S. picked it up. Here's a clip.
بداية تصويري هي بداية نهايتنا. جرافات؟ أنا متعب خير.
This Oscar-winning film follows Palestinian activist Basil Adra and Israeli journalist Yuval Abraham's coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Their coverage of the decimation in Gaza ruffled feathers. Israeli settlers in the West Bank beat the film's co-director Hamdan Balal, who was subsequently arrested by Israeli forces. He has since been released.
Questions remain why these movies in the U.S. continue to be shunned, sidelined, or silenced. Joining us now to dig in is journalist Lee Fang, whose own documentary faced similar soft suppression. Welcome back to Rising, Lee. Always nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
I think the part that struck me about this story really was, even beyond the censorship issue, which we can certainly discuss, is the filmmaker being violently attacked and then held. I'm glad to hear he has been released, but that is just shocking and beyond the pale in and of itself.
Yeah, that's right. Just 2 nights ago, the co-director was attacked by a group of masked Israeli Jewish settlers who were accompanied by Israeli military. They were throwing rocks. They beat him. They kind of seized him from the ambulance and took him to a prison. And really, it just seems very clear that the international attention, the fact that this was an Oscar-winning documentary, that reshapes the dynamic. That means you and I are talking about this. It receives major international attention in the news wires. Associated Press and many of the other mainstream media, legacy media outlets covered this. But the reality is these similar, really almost identical attacks, either by the military or by these kind of vigilante settlers, lynch mobs, are happening every week, every month in the West Bank, from Jenin to Susia to Hebron and many of the associated villages, Palestinian villages throughout the West Bank. These attacks have skyrocketed since October 7th. We've seen them on a regular basis, but most of these attacks do not receive any press attention, any international attention. If you look at some of the human rights groups that document these attacks, and you look at their YouTube sites or their websites, you can find videos of the military or these settlers attacking Palestinians, sometimes killing them, sometimes beating them, destroying their homes, bulldozing schools on a regular basis. And this is the type of lawlessness and oppression that Palestinians have been subjected to for a very long time.
Many Americans do not know the history here, of course. The last American president who took the view of what used to be America's official stance of an honest broker was Bill Clinton. Once George Bush got in office, he took the neocon view: any friend of Israel's is a friend of ours, and so forth, any enemy of Israel's. I think Obama was someone we hoped was going to come out and make an official statement that the occupation was illegal, that the settlements were illegal. Of course, he didn't do that. So if we look at all of this historically, the violence that's happening now could have easily been predicted. When I posted about this yesterday, Lee, about how this man needed to be released, I hashtagged, as it were, Marco Rubio. Do you think that there was any way in which the U.S. government, do you think the State Department called anybody in Netanyahu's cabinet and says this guy needs to be released, or do you think that the Israelis were smart enough to know that holding that filmmaker would continue to cause such an international furor?
Well, look, there aren't many tools for Palestinians in the West Bank to resist. To be clear, there are many different jurisdictions under Israeli control. In some parts of Israel, Palestinians have democratic rights and they can vote. But for the 2 to 3 million Palestinians that live in the West Bank, They live under military occupation. They do not have rights in civilian courts. They cannot vote for the government that rules over them. It's truly a segregated society. There are roads where, they say that Palestinians cannot walk. The major highways, the cars are segregated. The Palestinians who live in the West Bank can't travel to Israel proper and get jobs. It's almost impossible to receive a permit to build, to create a school or a home. They're subjected to this regular violence. And yes, the relations with the U.S. have always been fraught. There have been some Republicans going back to James Baker and some voices in the Bush administration that have voiced opposition to these settlements, but it's really been a uniparty problem. Both Democrats and Republicans have acquiesced to Israeli demands to continue building out these settlements, to continue this kind of varied forms of violence and oppression to Palestinians living in the West Bank. And it seems to have gotten worse. I kind of doubt that Marco Rubio is the reason that Hamdan Bilal was released. I think it's mostly the international pressure. And I think the film does a good job of showing that this is international pressure, publicity to these human rights violations is the best way of nonviolent resistance. We don't want violent resistance. I don't think anyone supports, any reasonable person supports violence from either side, from Israelis or from Palestinians. The best form of resistance is nonviolent. It's really kind of just showcasing these acts of oppression and bringing international solidarity. And the film does a great job of showing that, some of the only buildings, the only parts of the town of Mustafa Yatta where the film is kind of centered on, where the Israelis kind of stopped their demolition campaign, was a place where Tony Blair visited and kind of brought international attention. And that was really inspiring to the protagonists in the film. They said, okay, well, if we can bring enough international attention, perhaps we can stop the demolition of our communities.
I think that films like this are so important because people are learning things. There's another one that you might see that I would hope all of our audience would be interested in. It's called There Is Another Way, which goes further into this peace-building, nonviolent conversation, which of course has been so set back because of this war. But it might be something you want to look at. It's called There Is Another Way. It was executive produced actually by James Cameron.
Talk to us more about the film company not finding an American release for it. Obviously it's not exactly censorship if people just decide there's not a financial reason to do this, but if it's because of pressure, it can certainly create a censorship kind of effect. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, that's right. Over the last decade, and certainly increasing after October 7th, it's been virtually impossible for any new documentary or film highlighting Palestinian human rights issues or that's critical of Israel to find a major distributor, to obtain access to a U.S. streaming platform. If you look at the Oscar winners this year, every single one of them has a distributor. Every single one of them you can find on a streaming partner. This Oscar-winning documentary you can't view in the U.S. Because it can't find a distributor. No streaming platform will pick it up. And this is not unusual for a film that is critical of Israeli human rights. As you mentioned at the top of the segment, I helped film a documentary with a Norwegian company, Up North Films, on that kind of explored the Christian Zionist movement and how it shaped the human rights crisis in Israel, Praying for Armageddon. We worked for over a year to get a streaming partner, to get a distributor. We found streaming partners and distributors in Israel, in Europe, in most of the world. The only place where we could not find it was in North America, in the United States specifically. And this is typical. I mean, on my Substack, I listed about a dozen other films that have faced this problem. And I don't know if censorship is the right term. That seems to be applicable here. We don't know if the government is making a direct appeal. We've seen just in the last month, the mayor of Miami Beach, Steve Miner, threatening to revoke a lease and to shut down a theater for showing this film. The only place that you can really see it throughout the U.S. are independent small theaters. I watched it in the Bay Area at a small kind of indie theater that kind of shows art house films, but major kind of networks of theaters are not picking it up. And it seems clear that this is the result of a organized pressure campaign from pro-Israel groups that send threats to the major distributors, that send threats to the streaming platforms. Early on in this post-October 7th conflict, I obtained thousands of WhatsApp messages from major tech executives and other prominent people who are organizing pro-Israel efforts. And one of their focus was removing films critical of Israel from Netflix. So there is this kind of organized campaign. There's at times we get kind of peeks behind the curtain, but there is an effort to kind of just prevent Americans from seeing the other side, to seeing the kind of
but Joanne,
seeing any criticism of Israel.
It's so important, Lee. I certainly agree with everything that you're saying, and it's also important that this plague of cancel culture and censorship has gone both ways at this point. Gal Gadot, the Israeli actress who simply wanted to wear a pin about freeing the hostage, there were actually letters circulating in Hollywood that she shouldn't even be allowed to be at the Oscars. So I just think we need to talk about any kind of shutting anyone up on either side of that issue. We need to be very, very vocal about saying that should not be occurring. But thank you very much for your work.
Thanks, Lee. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
More Rising right after this.